Thank you, Yana, for that very generous introduction. Folks, I want to start with a confession. I lost my bag getting here today. I missed my flight getting here today. And so to add to my normal nervousness that I feel these days, I've had these additional things. But basically these days when I speak to any audience, I'm very nervous because, and I'll tell you in an anecdote, I was speaking to a bunch of folks in the United States who are involved in environmental foundations and trusts. And I was running off, how we are running out of time on climate, how as we sit here today, every 2 seconds a forest the size of a football field will disappear. The fact that within 4 decades, because of the triple whammy of overfishing, dumping of toxics, including oil spills and ocean acidification, which is basically a problem of more and more carbon and less forests, our oceans are turning to acid and our oceans could be dead in 4 decades. By the way, that's not a statistic from Greenpeace, that's a statistic from Newsweek, which you will know is not a particularly left-wing radical or environmentally friendly magazine, so you should get nervous. So anyway, at the end of my speech, in the question and answer time, a young woman put up her hand and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, he inspired me as a young activist." And then she asked me, "Do you know what his most famous speech is called?" And thinking it was a trick question, I very tentatively said, I have a dream. And she shouted back at me, she said, "Yes, it was I Have a Dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The oceans are collapsing, the forests are being destroyed, and we're at the..." So one of the challenges of the moment of history that we live in is how do we speak truth to power, and how do we actually do it in a way that people do not feel it's over, or people do not feel that the only way that we can actually make the transition that we need to make to secure humanity is through a miracle. People have to believe that it's within their grasp of being able to, and if you tell the truth in the most graphic ways, it can scare the shit out of people to the point where it actually immobilizes. So that's one of the challenges that we face. So secondly, staying with Martin Luther King, I just want to provoke you a little bit by sharing this little video which Martin Luther King speaking in the 1960s. Where does it show, by the way?
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
I just want to repeat the last bit for you. I refuse to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are trapped in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. Now, of course, he was speaking about the United States in the 60s, early 70s, but that fact applies eloquently to all of us around the world today. So I was invited, my friend Adil, who twisted my arm to stay for an additional week to be here, which I'm very happy she did. She said, "No, you can talk about the political miracle of the transition from apartheid to democracy. And I want to suggest to you something strange. I want to say to you that, in fact, I do not consider the transition from apartheid to democracy without as much bloodshed as everybody predicted as a miracle. Actually, I think the miracles in political and social terms are something quite different. Let me give you some examples of what I think are miracles. I think it's a miracle that the banks and the bankers were able to engage in mass fraudulent activities, and they were able to actually come out of this with the very people that they defrauded, the taxpayer, bailing them out, and still at the end of that year they still got bonuses. I think it's a miracle that, in fact, after so many years of women activists around the world standing up for gender equality, we still today have only 10% of leadership in government and business reflective of women's leadership. I think it's a miracle that Donald Trump has got so far ahead in the election process as he's got. So I think we have to ask ourselves a very big question in this context of thinking about miracles is about, actually, are we going to be able to rise to address the convergence of crises that humanity faces right now? Is the only way we're going to be able to rise to those challenges is we have to expect miracles to happen around us. Because right now, if you're brutally honest and you're reading the science, you're watching extreme weather events, which have increased by more than 100% in the last 10 years, then in fact, surely you are getting anxious about how we're going to get out of the mess that we're in. So for me, when I heard this term miracle and marathon together, it evoked a very interesting memory for me. And it wasn't the word miracle, but the word marathon. So I just want to ask you to bear with me a little bit. When I was 22 years old, I was fleeing South Africa into exile. And my best friend at that time, a guy called Lenny, asked me a question. He was also fleeing and we were going in different directions. And he asked me, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution you can make to the cause of justice and the cause of humanity? So without blinking an eyelid, I said, oh, that's a very simple question. It's giving your life. And he said, you mean participating in a demonstration, getting shot and killed and becoming a martyr, which was happening in South Africa on a regular basis at that time. We were generally every other weekend at funerals burying activists that had been murdered by the regime. So I said, yeah, I guess so. He said, no, that's the wrong answer. He said, it's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. Now, I was 22 years old at that time. My friend Lenny was way ahead of me in every possible way. He was the first environmentalist I ever met. And I have it on fairly reliable authority that at that time, he was one of only 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. So he was a special guy. So anyway, we hugged each other. We fled into exile in different directions. And sadly, less than 2 years after we fled, I get a call that while I was a student at Oxford University, I got the call that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from my home city, Durban, were brutally murdered by the apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in their bodies, their parents couldn't even recognize them at the mortuary. So obviously I had to think deep and hard about the distinction between giving your life versus giving the rest of your life. And that's a very important distinction. Because what Lenny was saying, the struggle for gender justice, social justice, political justice, economic justice, the justice for indigenous peoples, all the things that progressive and caring people care about, those struggles are not sprints, but they are marathons. that in fact, the biggest contribution any one of us can make when we understand an injustice is to say to ourselves that this is an injustice that I will commit myself for as long as I live to put my energies to try to eradicate that justice, and I will not rest until. Now, if you take a guy like Robert Mugabe, actually, why go to Robert Mugabe? Let's take Tony Blair. So when Tony Blair got elected as Prime Minister, there was a lot of optimism. He appointed the largest number of women as Member of Parliament, only to blow it all in the first week by taking a photograph with all those women with a subtitle there called Blair's Babes, which I think kind of lost the message somehow. And today, decent people around the world consider Tony Blair as one thing, and that he is simply a war criminal. As what was that commission? That Chilcot said, if he was an African head of state, he'll be sitting in The Hague now facing the International Criminal Court. So what I'm saying is that a person can come and taste power, right, like Mugabe did more than 30 years ago, and then get stuck in the obsession of power, and you almost feel you need a miracle to get them out of power. So we are living in a very tricky time, but I want to, because I saw somebody look like they were about to cry, so I want to just give you some good news. As somebody who's been involved in the environmental movement, I have been guilty of at some point or the other saying, we need to save the planet, we need to save the environment, we need to save the climate. The good news, my dear brothers and sisters, is that the planet does not need any saving. The planet actually is just fine. Because if we continue on the trajectory that we are, do not listen to what the scientists say we need to do and should have done already, continue to have this dependency on a form of energy that is suicidal for our children and their children's future, what will be the end result? We'll warm up the planet to a point where water will be restricted, land to grow food will be restricted, and that then gives you food restrictions. But then that also comes with a planet that is hot to the point where many people will not be able to live. So the end result is, if we don't make the changes fast enough, we will be gone. The planet actually will still be here. And actually, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. Understand that this struggle of climate change is whether humanity can very, very fast, because we lost so much of time, get our act together and understand that humanity needs to fashion a different way of existing in a mutually interdependent relationship with nature for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's future. So to conclude, I have to say that right now, the knowledge is there of how we can change. The scientific evidence is crystal clear. What is missing is political will. And that political will, I believe, must now be generated by citizens understanding that future generations are at risk, as well as current generations, and doing whatever exceptional things we need to do, however difficult it might be, however miraculous it might sound to some. If we have any sense of intergenerational responsibility, then what we should be doing is planning now, making those changes, and so on. But if I'm brutally honest, if we are going to succeed and secure this planet, it's going to need a combination of moral courage on the part of millions of people. It's going to need high-quality, ongoing scientific work, innovation, and redesign of how we live on this planet. And dare I say, if we are going to succeed, we're going to need also a shitload of miracles to help us along the way. Thank you very much.